it's exactly the same playbook that you see here. The USAID was at one point very, very active in Nicaragua, and since then they have all been kicked out, and because there are unregistered foreign agents trying to destabilize the country and overthrow the government.
Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales. Today, joining us from Nicaragua is Benjamin Rubinstein. Is going to talk a little bit about Niger and about some fake news from Nicaragua. So welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let's just get into it. We're talking about this story that has been all over social media, especially alternative outlets, that Russia has signed a deal with Nicaragua to build a military base and post ballistic missiles that could reach America in Nicaragua. So could you run down, how true is this story and where it came from and what you found out?
Right. So, and I think it was January of 2022, Russia and Nicaragua signed an agreement to sort of have police and military training together. And that is the extent of the agreement. However, recently there has been a lot of posts that seem to source this report from back in 2022 as including missiles that could reach the United States. As far as I'm aware, this is not true. There's no articles about this in Nicaraguan media. There's no opposition Nicaraguans talking about it. I've spoken to my sources and nobody has heard about it. And I have very good sources. So as far as I'm aware, this is completely fake news. And as I mentioned, the opposition is not speaking about it. And if this were true and this were new news, they would be losing their minds. They all live in Miami, so which was supposedly where these missiles can reach. So, they are not talking about that at all. They're actually mostly focused on the closure of a Catholic university, a private Catholic university that had been a center of organizing sort of the terrorist coup plotting of 2018, in which the government has now converted into a public university, which is free for low-income families.
You would also expect.
Where do you think the?
Go ahead.
Yeah, where do you think the fake news started from? The ones who started it, or what is the purpose of this?
Yeah,
fake
well,
news?
Unfortunately, it's coming from anti-imperialist accounts, and my personal opinion is that a lot of the larger OSINT accounts are now chasing engagement so they can get their Twitter ad revenue sharing payday, and deleting something removes valuable impressions. So there is a degree of irresponsibility going on at this moment, in my view.
Well, I would also expect DC to be very vocal about something like this, especially in a time when they're losing this proxy war in Ukraine. They wanted something else to talk about, and if Nicaragua was pulling a Cuban Missile Crisis, that would be all over. Right. This is a new threat or whatever, and there isn't a peep from DC about it.
There is a new round of sanctions that have just come out on Nicaragua, but they did not mention this supposed missile, and it's only visa restrictions for 100 people in Nicaragua.
That's not
which is not a proportional response in diplomatic terms to alleged, cruise missiles being stationed in Nicaragua. And so I'm highly skeptical of this news. I do not think it's true. I do not think that it is in Nicaragua's interest to store missiles from the Russian Federation here. And not only that, missiles are quite large. If they had transported cruise missiles to Nicaragua, I think, that probably would have made the mainstream media.
I mean,
do you hear people talking about it? Sorry, we're talking over each other.
Transporting them in international waters like that, and America knows they're going to Nicaragua, they'll just blow the boat up. There would be no question that that's what.
Well, they might not blow the boat up, but they might. I mean, it could, just because that would be a direct attack on the Russian Federation, but but also that they would not let it go unnoticed, for one, and the repercussions would be far more significant than 100 visa restrictions for people who are probably never going to go to the United States
Right.
anyways.
Well, you would think it would look like a direct attack, but they got away with Nord Stream, so I'm sure they could figure out a way to do it.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Satara, go ahead.
Are people in Nicaragua talking about it? So do you hear anyone from Nicaraguans talking about it? Is it
the most I've seen is Sandinista accounts? The most I've seen and heard is Sandinista accounts saying it's fake news.
Oh, okay.
But it's gone very much unnoticed here. The talk of the town right now is the closing of the Catholic University, basically.
Well, the Sandinistas aren't. I mean, they it'd be something to be. The only way you could make that palatable is if you had pride in it happening, because otherwise it's a horrifying. I mean, in order to have that occur, you would have to have such confidence in the fecundity of the Sandinista regime, that government, that you wouldn't fear it, like, because the U.S. immediately is going to start regime change tactics, which is corrupting the officials and doing whatever they can to, like, destroy the government, because they want that to end. So if you believe that your government is maybe not that, I mean, you would have to have real confidence, and you would be cheering it on because you would have this confidence.
I think that confidence actually does exist. I think
that's great, and I think you're right.
All these things, and the support within the government for the Sandinista party is overwhelming. It is also overwhelming among, the working class of Nicaragua, which make up an overwhelming portion of the country. So I do think they have that support, and if the decision was made, that everyone would be quite gung-ho about it. They'd be actually very excited, posting about it and all that. And the fact that they're not is an indication in itself. Now, there is a very small chance that, this was some sort of secret deal that was made, and it got leaked to Russian media, and that's what happened. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case. It doesn't make sense at all. So as far as my view goes, it's completely false, and people are just chasing this sort of Twitter ad sharing revenue. And I think that is really unfortunate and really irresponsible, because there are more sanctions in front of the US Congress right now, and that is yet to be decided. But this kind of fake news about the foreign relations of countries that have been under sort of the boot of the United States can help move along consensus for more sanctions. So shame on the people sharing this without verifying the information.
Yeah,
in
Chris,
relation to this event, like, what is the on the street view of Russia, the special military operation in Ukraine, and BRICS? Like, how do Nicaraguans, Sandinistas view these events and these organizations that are happening? Do they view, like, are they gung ho about BRICS? Do they think this is a good step forward? I assume they do. I just haven't heard anything about Nicaragua and BRICS, and I also haven't heard anything about how Nicaraguans view Ukraine and Russia. So I would love to hear what that's like.
Yeah, well, okay, so I guess I should start by saying that, the support for the Sandinista government and even party as a separate entity is overwhelming. I'd say it's anywhere between 75 to 80% of the country supports them, and even people who don't directly support them will vote for them in elections because they understand what the alternative is.
Wow.
That being said, yeah, it's actually quite impressive. That being said, the support for the special military operation and the war against Ukraine is in line with those numbers as well. It's basically only, the light-skinned bourgeois class that are against the special military operation in the Sandinista party. So there is a consensus in support of Russia, a very strong consensus in the support of Russia. Sometimes you can see, people with Russian flags in parades. There are a lot of parades, FSLN parades in Managua and throughout the country, and sometimes you'll see Russian flags. And people
Ukrainian flags.
I've never seen a single Ukrainian flag in this country. Not a single Ukrainian flag.
Smart people.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that there were like you mentioned that there were new sanctions by the United States against 100 individuals in Nicaragua, and it means that they can't travel to the United States, which they probably never wanted to travel. And I think this is like very similar to what they do to Iranians. Like you see that every time there are new people sanctioned, like Iranian official sanctions, and it's only symbolic because these people do not have any like financial reservings outside Iran. They have never wanted to travel to any other country, so it doesn't really mean anything. But do you, because you have also studied the way Masih al-Nejad and the anti-Iran propaganda worked last year. Do you see any similarities between the anti-Iran propaganda and the propaganda against Nicaragua, or maybe anti-Russian propaganda, which is targeted or directed to Nicaraguan people?
That's a great question. I think it's really a part of the same playbook. There's striking similarities. Every time, maybe there is some like slightly legitimate grievance because no government is perfect. The US comes in, exploits it, lies to people, finds bad actors with influence, gives them money, and they just go to town, dishonest actors trying to convince people. A lot of people in 2018, when the coup attempt first popped off here, they thought they were protesting against a reduction in the age of payments for the age of retirement or Social Security. And they protested and they protested and they protested. The government repealed that and said, okay, you guys are unhappy, never mind. We're getting rid of this. They kept protesting, and soon these protests escalated into like roadblocks and like cops and people and Sandinistas getting tortured and murdered, and rampant violence. And I think that's a lot of what we saw. There was what happened in September in Iran. Masa Amini, unfortunately died, and you had these bad actors spreading fake news and lying to people. These people who are literally Masih al-Nejad is literally paid by Voice of America. And so, I think it's exactly the same playbook that you see here. The USAID was at one point very, very active in Nicaragua, and since then they have all been kicked out. And because there are unregistered foreign agents trying to destabilize the country and overthrow the government, quite literally. It's not just like, oh, you're protesting in the streets. It's like, no, you tried to overthrow the government. Like, that is not legal. And the same thing happened in Iran, as you know very well. So, yeah, I definitely think it's straight from the same playbook.
The difference in Iran is they allow like the BBC Persia and things, and from my perspective, it's very confusing as to why they do that, because there is so much toxic propaganda that's just injected directly into the brains of young people in Iran, and they don't understand the value of a people's revolution because of this propaganda. So, it's a
well, there was a few remaining opposition outlets like CNN. Until recently, CNN is Spanish has now been kicked out. But like Iran, the support for the government is overwhelming. In Iran, it's like 70-80% support. So as far as I'm aware, so to an extent, like I get it. You want to give people their free speech, as it were. I don't consider it free speech to have these opposition outlets, but some people do, and you don't want to incur repercussions. And the support is so overwhelming that it's not really going to make a difference. That being said, I do go a step further than some people, and I wish that the Nicaraguan government here would ban Facebook and TikTok, because they are just propaganda factories. And fortunately, they have an education system which explains the actual geopolitical dynamic to people here, but that has not always been the case. For example, my girlfriend, she's a year younger than me. She was in school during the neoliberal era, and they didn't learn about Augusto Sandino, the national hero. They didn't learn about Simon Bolivar.
Wow.
And so we're actually watching the Bolivar movie on a series on Netflix because it's actually a very historically accurate thing, and she's actually learning from it. But kids these days, under the Sandinistas who came into power again in 2008, learn about Bolivar, they learn about Augusto Sandino, they learn about sanctions, they learn about imperialism, they learn about the history of Russia and World War II and all of that.
That's great. That's really
that's great.
And even some campesinos have textbooks. Some farmers have textbooks that teach about, not all, but some of them teach about dialectical and historical materialism to actual children, which is a very advanced concept to be teaching children. But I've seen textbooks containing this information.
If only we could do that in the U.S.
That's
Some
great.
states here are banning TikTok, which I think is, it's obviously a partisan, hackery. But
I think there's some confusion about TikTok, because they want to ban it because it's Chinese media, but it's actually not. It's actually not in the United States. It's completely controlled by an American oligarch who has NATO psychological warfare officers determining the content that is allowed and not allowed. So, I actually kind of wish that they would ban TikTok in the United States as well, because from my perspective, it's very bad for the minds of young children, not just because of propaganda, but first and foremost in the United States, at least, because it's teaching kids to seek instant gratification, to be over materialistic, to say, oh, this is the new thing, I want to buy that, and oh, this person is so pretty, I want to look like that, and it's driving them further from their human nature in my mind. So that is maybe my extreme perspective, but that is, I wish that TikTok didn't exist in the United States as well.
That's how I felt about Instagram, because Instagram was not blocked in Iran until yeah, exactly. And it wasn't blocked in Iran. I mean, Twitter and Facebook were blocked, but Instagram was not. And I always thought, Twitter has its own problems, but it's a different system than Instagram, and Instagram is a lot more harmful, I think. And it got blocked only after all these protests. But yeah, it's exactly the same problem. And while it was not blocked, I think, there was a striking great majority of Iranians having accounts on Instagram. So it was really terrible. So that's just the only thing that I'm happy it's blocked.
Well, I remember when Qasem Soleimani died, I posted photos of his funeral on Facebook, which, as you know, millions of people attended. And my account, since that happened, has been under sanctions on Facebook. My posts on Facebook, they tell me this. That is literally in my account panel, that it's been under sanctions for years simply for posting a photo or a few photos of Qasem Soleimani's funeral. So I think it's absolutely reasonable to want to get rid of these sort of platforms that literally act as a tool of the sort of hegemonic toolkit of the State Department.
Yeah, some people get flagged because there's a little picture of one of these characters that the government doesn't want, just in the background of another picture. And
the same thing happened in Xinjiang. They were literally organizing terrorist groups in Xinjiang, and so China told Facebook, listen, you got to get rid of this, and they didn't. And they told Twitter, you got to get rid of this under previous management, and they didn't. And so they got removed from the country. I mean, you can still access them with a VPN, which anyone can download a VPN, and there are free ones. There are millions of VPNs. I was in Russia and Moscow recently. Yeah, no, they know how to do it. It's not complicated. I was in Russia recently, and it took me like 12 VPNs until I found one that actually worked. But I was able to connect to Instagram and Twitter, and no one was gonna like the FSB wasn't gonna show up in my hotel room and arrest me for using a VPN.
Yeah, the same in Iran. Yeah, everyone is like any gathering you go, everyone is talking about like, what's your VPN? Is it working? And the secret, especially for the free ones, is that you shouldn't tell other people because then there are many users and it stops working. So
it's the same thing.
Everyone has learned.
It's the same thing. You know, I was undergoing correspondent training in Moscow, and you know, in the RT offices, and everyone's like, "Oh, what's your VPN? Does it work? Does it work?" You know, everyone's trading VPNs. You talk to the leadership, and they're like, "Oh yeah, try this one." So it's like everyone's doing it. And
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
you know, I think the government understands that like people who work in like media, you know, need access to this. You know, and so they're not like. It's not like they're you know they're just making it a little more difficult, I guess, so it's harder for the propaganda to be disseminated amongst the population.
But also,
Yeah,
VPNs
that's true.
controlled by the FSB. I mean, they could be all backdoored by the FSB, and then you're just basically providing them all of your data. So,
well, a lot of
that's true.
Well, you know, I think that the FSB has the capabilities of getting that data if they want it, but also a lot of the VPNs that work in Russia are VPNs from other countries that that are just small and unknown.
Yeah. Well, it's the same like when any VPN, they basically.
But those ones are backdoored by the CIA, so you know it's a trade-off.
Exactly, that's what I mean. Yeah. Exactly. So, Sarah, you were going to comment about a picture you took. What was it?
Yeah, I was once just walking, I mean, in Esfahan, near one of the historical bridges, and there was a banner in honor of Qasem Soleimani, and it was at a corner of the picture that I took of the historical bridge, and Instagram removed that picture and warned me that this is like promoting terrorism. But the more funny one I would say was it was just a few months ago on the Al Quds Day rally in Isfahan, like in support of Palestine. I took a picture of a young boy, like a teenage boy, sitting on the lawns in the square with the flag of Iran on his shoulder, and the view was this historical palace, this guy wearing a Iranian flag, and like grass and people like having fun and stuff. And again, if this was like Instagram told me I'm promoting terrorist organizations and I have to remove the picture. So what I did was I removed the picture, but I posted it again with so I support Ukraine flags and stickers like around, and this time it was okay. So Instagram allowed me.
You could probably have done that with a swastika, as long as you put "I support Ukraine" stickers around it. It's totally acceptable.
Exactly.
It's true.
Yeah, I learned how to do it now.
So one question I asked earlier was about BRICS, so we didn't really get to that. How is it? What is there a lot of public discourse about the idea of BRICS and whether that could help Nicaragua avoid sanctions and that sort of thing?
Well, you know, there is discussion about it. There's been no movement from the government, at least publicly, regarding BRICS, but everyone is generally supportive of BRICS. I think that from my personal perspective is that BRICS is going to eventually be something that the Nicaraguan government is interested in. Right now, their main trading partner is still the United States, and they are close to the United States. So, you know, they might be waiting until BRICS strengthens as an entity. Now, one way I see BRICS sort of coming into play in Nicaragua in the future is for the canal project, which I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with, but the Nicaraguan government for some years now has wanted to build sort of a modern rival to the Panama Canal, which would have a far greater capacity.
By Lago, Nicaragua, right?
By what's that?
By the lake. They want to go into one side of the lake and out the other. Isn't that the plan?
They want to. So there's 3 proposed routes. the six proposed routes, 3 of the 6 travel through blue fields and go the Caribbean coast and go all the way down through the big lake, as you mentioned, and then out the other end, sort of near Managua. And I recommend anyone who's not familiar with the geography to, look at a map and you'll see what I'm talking about. But, this would be a very powerful sort of system of commerce that would direct a lot of resources to the global south instead of, the United States if it was controlled by Nicaragua. So currently, in the Discord leaks, I published 2 documents about Nicaragua, one about Iran. And, the U.S. government is aware that the Nicaraguan government is in negotiations with a Chinese port engineering company to develop a deep water port in Bluefields, which is the origin of the 3 of the 6 proposed canal routes. So, it's a very big project, billions and billions of dollars, and Nicaragua cannot finance that on their own. So while China could play a role in helping, I think it's also likely when BRICS strengthens that, maybe they get a loan from the BRICS bank to help finance this project alongside,
That would be great.
Chinese companies doing the actual work because they have the expertise and all of that.
What's the estimation of like time to completion that you've seen on that project? Like 10 years or?
Yeah, 10 to 15 years would be my personal estimate because currently it hasn't actually, there's been no actual work. There was some work being done a while back, but it got postponed because of economic conditions and a shady Chinese company. I'm not saying all Chinese companies are shady, but this one was, being irresponsible in some ways as far as I'm aware. So, they're working with new people now. And since then, the Nicaraguan government has reestablished relations after many decades with the People's Republic of China. So I think, all these things sort of tie into each other. So 10 to 15 years would probably be a realistic timeline. But Daniel Ortega, the Comandante, President Daniel Ortega, has, said that the canal is necessary. And he's not wrong. The Panama Canal can't currently handle the volume of commerce that goes through it. And I just saw a video last night. There are 200 boats stuck in the Panama Canal currently. Wow. With stuff, with goods and whatnot. And they can't travel through the Panama Canal because the water is too low. So, it's a major issue, and the Panama Canal is very outdated. It's not very wide. And so, yeah, the canal is definitely necessary. And, this canal could, bring billions of dollars to working class people throughout the southern part of the continent in Latin America. So, it could literally raise millions of people out of poverty. And I think, Nicaragua recognizes that, China recognizes that. And if we do want to build a multipolar world, we do need to get rid of the poverty in the global south, and especially in Latin America, because it's so close to the United States.
Yeah, well, BRIC sounds like a great project for BRIC, because that sure would put the pinch on America and its
right.
canal. So
yeah, BRICS financed Chinese developed Nicaraguan rival to the Panama Canal would be not only would it be a major part of the Belt and Road Initiative, in my view, but it would really change it would be a sort of another dent in the hegemony of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, if it still exists in 15 years, we'll see about that. I don't know. It seems to be on a spiral these days, and BRICS is supposed to this week announce its own currency, right? A gold-based currency, which is a little bit better.
Supposedly, I'm sort of a wait and see, but I definitely think that this meeting in Johannesburg has the potential to sort of be the harbinger of significant geopolitical change.
Yeah, I think so. I hope Iran gets to be part of BRICS. I heard a couple interviews recently that makes it sound like BRICS is actually very open to accepting all the, I think, 20 applicants that they've had. So hopefully they just accept all of them. I don't see what the downside would be. So
right. Well, right now there's no actual framework to accept a new member, so they've got to get that ironed out, and I think that's part of what they'll be doing in Johannesburg.
Yeah. Well, that'll be interesting to watch that come to pass. Maybe now we should switch to talk about Niger.
Yeah.
That quite a bit. So, could you give us a rundown on what you think the current situation? I think everyone who's listening is aware that Niger had a military coup, is what the West is calling it, where the president that was aligned with French imperialism was given the boot, put in prison. He's actually on trial now, I think, and then the West reacted terribly to losing this. That's because there's a lot of uranium and other natural resources there that they were getting sweetheart deals in, and then they rallied Ecowas, which is a coalition of imperialist aligned West African states, military alliance, kind of like a NATO for Africa. And
it's not a military alliance; it's an economic alliance with a minor
okay.
military component. Yeah,
with a military component. Okay,
yeah,
so it's a political alliance that is biased to the West, and they're now threatening to use them as a proxy army against Niger to reinstate their puppet. So take it away. What did I get wrong, and what do you see?
Well, I think ECOWAS, if I'm not mistaken, it stands for like Economic Union of West African States. I might be getting the second word wrong, but basically, they have a history of invasion going back to, I believe, the 1990s. They've been involved in 5 invasions. A few have been to sort of reverse military juntas taking power, and a few have been to fight back against sort of extremist Islamic insurgents of the, sort of ISIS, Al-Qaeda variation. So, that
economic in quotes is what you're saying.
Economic, right? Because but at the end of the day, everything's economic, even wars, as we know. So there's been a lot of developments. General Ticini, who was a part of the president's part of the president's bodyguards, basically, overthrew President Bazoum. And some people are calling it a coup. Some people are calling it a revolution. I'm calling it a coup-volution because it was a coup. Like, he did seize power, but it's also wildly popular. The Economist did a poll. The Economist, which is an imperialist outlet, did a poll in Niger that shows it has a 78% approval rating. The military.
Wow, 78%.
Better than Biden.
And that's economic.
Right, and that's coming from The Economist. So if an imperialist newspaper is saying, oh, look how popular this is, they're not going to publish something that is against their interest if it isn't undeniably true. And you can see it in the streets. You can see the other day, I think it was yesterday, there were thousands of people in the streets, protesting in support of the military government. And not only that, but the government put out a call, I think it was 3 days ago, for people to volunteer. And there are thousands of Nigerian volunteers arriving. And there are even volunteers from Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, and Chad arriving to Niger to join military service. And it's worth noting that, Wagner is also, present in West Africa unofficially. The Mali government doesn't recognize it, but there are Wagner troops in Mali. And, about 2 weeks ago, a high-level diplomat in the military government traveled to Mali, met with the president and someone in Wagner, and came back, and shortly after that, rumors of agreements and advisors arriving in Niger were present, and
cargo planes too have been the rumors of
Supposedly, I wasn't able to confirm if that was from a previous event or not, but it's clear that Wagner is present, and Prigozhin himself is actually now in Africa as of today. He's in Africa, which is a big deal. He put out a video of him, and I haven't had the chance to watch that video, but he is presently in Africa and likely in West Africa. And Mali and Wagner had so basically there's been a rise in sort of attacks by extremists in the area in West Africa since this all started. And you can say, maybe the U.S. or France is responsible for that, but it's speculation.
Wasn't it like 70,000% or so, 7,000%, some crazy percentage higher? And like when the U.S. put anti-terrorism forces, terrorism itself actually went up like 7,000%. Like it wasn't a problem before, and then it became a problem when America was around.
Absolutely, and even since the coup took place, there's been an escalation. There, in West Africa, there's 2 to 3 attacks a week, big attacks. Like dozens of people being murdered. So the insurgents, these extremists, had seized a UN base in Mali earlier last week, and actually soldiers in the Mali military and Wagner actually took this base back and then handed it over to the United Nations. So Wagner actually returned a base of the United Nations back to the United Nations after it had been seized by extremists, which I think says quite a bit about Wagner's very deliberate behavior of Wagner. So I think that's
that definitely wasn't reported very widely in the West.
No, it wasn't. It went super under the radar. That being said, Ecowas is in a really strange position right now because they've got all this pressure from France, who needs their uranium and their gold, but it's also about the pipeline. And the pipeline is a big deal because Europe no longer has the Nord Stream pipeline as their backup plan, and now they're paying these exorbitant prices on oil from the United States, and Europe's backup plan to the Nord Stream was this pipeline that travels through Niger, travels through Nigeria, and into Europe. So now that is up in the air, it reminds me of a quote from a former French president, Jacques Chirac, who I'm paraphrasing, but who said that, France would be downgraded to the status of a third world developing nation without Africa. And now, France has lost resources in Mali, France has lost resources in Burkina Faso, and now Niger. And this pipeline, their saving grace, their salvation, is also in question. So I think France is putting as much pressure as possible on Ecowas to invade. And, Ecowas has Nigeria, has Senegal, the Ivory Coast, and there's one other, and Benin, who have signed on to say, we will send troops. That being said, in Nigeria, there is widespread disapproval of this decision. In most of West Africa, there's widespread disapproval. Inflation in Nigeria is at an 18-year high right now. Senegal, another country that's signed on to this and indicates their support, is facing massive protests. The Ivory Coast has a lot of problems. Nigeria should be dealing with Boko Haram. They shouldn't be worrying about invading their neighbor, and where a lot of the people from Niger and Nigeria are a part of the same tribe. They're like brothers. So this is extremely unpopular. And so, it may be the case that Nigeria is trying to save face for ECOWAS at this point, or it may be the case that, France has really put the thumb on the button and really pressuring them. Now, that being said, the United States is in a very unique position here because they have, multiple drone bases. One of them cost like $100 million to build, and supposedly they use this to, for surveillance purposes against extremists. But there have been attacks on like convoys coming from Chad heading to Niger, and these extremists find out the location, and there's only one real way they would get that intelligence, and that is from this U.S. drone base. So the U.S. does not want to lose their drone base, so that is why Victoria Nuland went to Niger to try to ensure the safety of their drone base. Now, they've started drawing up plans in case there is actually an invasion. They do need to leave, but from my view, the U.S. has once again thrown France under the bus, much like you saw in the submarine deal with AUKUS, because the U.S. interests are not exactly aligned with European interests in Niger. Not only do they want Europe to not have, a pipeline so that they're forced to buy oil from the United States at insane prices, but they also want to maintain their intelligence gathering capabilities in the region, which come under direct threat if there is actually an invasion.
So did Victoria Nuland, was she successful? What was the outcome? I mean, I know the answer.
Well, the base hasn't been evacuated yet, and I think
she left without basically she left empty-handed. Is the news story.
I'm not sure she actually did leave empty-handed. I think that part of the reason the initial invasion was delayed was because of this. I mean, of course, we are yet to see what happens, and the U.S. is drawing up plans to evacuate that drone base, but that is in case of an invasion. And so obviously, if there is an invasion, they evacuate their drone base. That's all sorts of intelligence they lose out on. And, the possibility that Ecowas is able to, sort of reinstall their president and get back to work on this pipeline. That being said, I actually don't see a path to victory for Ecowas. It's very clear that Russia is not going to allow another Libya to happen. And not only that, there's been no reports on this, but just a basic analysis of the behavior of Iran and the IRGC will tell you that they're likely involved in some capacity. So, it would be basically, and I also believe that Algeria and Chad would align militarily with, now so far they're saying, we want diplomatic solutions, but if push comes to shove and there is actually an invasion by Ecowas that's being used as France as a proxy, I think you will see certain factions within the geopolitical landscape taking more hardline positions, and that includes Chad, Iran, Algeria, and Russia.
Yeah, well,
so I don't see a path to victory for Ecowas because also, Mali and Burkina Faso are clearly on the side of Niger, and so is Guinea. So Guinea would also probably take a more militaristic stance as well in the event of an actual invasion. And I'm not saying, Iran is going to, send troops there, but they might provide intelligence. They might provide drone capabilities. Or training, and they might already be providing some sort of advisor role, much like Wagner is. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm sorry, that was kind of long-winded. But
oh wait, there. Okay, we lost you. We lost you for a second. So I was saying maybe Victoria Nuland just needs some better flavored cookies to encourage ECOWAS to get the job done. But seriously, I think it's fascinating when you look at the coalition members that you mentioned who are being recruited to intimidate Niger. None of them could ever even come close to a 78% approval rating for their governments. In fact, they're all basically just hanging on with a string. And so it's really fascinating. I mean, a noteworthy thing that happened yesterday was they actually, in Niamey, the capital of Niger, they actually had to close military recruiting centers because there were so many young men.
Yeah, the image is very amazing. The video.
Yeah. So if you compare that to example Nuland's favorite place, Ukraine, where they're having to kidnap young men out of school and off the street and basically beat them into submission and then just dump them out into minefields to get blown up on the front line. It's a totally different ball game between what's happening in Ukraine and what might potentially kick off in Africa.
Right, and that is my fear, and the fear I think of many people, is that a war in Niger wouldn't be like the war in Ukraine. It wouldn't be able to be contained like the war in Ukraine is being contained. It would spread into a regional war. And actually, the Turkish president Erdogan has said that the military option is not an option because of just that, because it would spread like wildfire, wouldn't be able to be contained, and it would drag in nations across West Africa. And not only that, but if these countries that are threatening to invade, Senegal, the Ivory Coast, Benin, and Nigeria, if they do actually invade, they're all incredibly unpopular. I'm not entirely sure about the popularity of the Benin government. It's a relatively small country, but Senegal, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, they have their massive problems. And Nigeria has Boko Haram. They have corruption. Bola Tinubu is not a popular figure. He's just extremely wealthy from, trafficking heroin in Chicago, which the Gray Zone helped expose to a Western audience recently.
So how would the soldiers...
And I know that they are also...
Go ahead.
The Nigerian government has also been very oppressive of the Shia religious minority there, and we know how they have treated Sheikh Zakzaki, who is a Shia religious leader, and his children have been killed by his troops, and he and his wife have been arrested, and all sorts of those things.
And compare that to the situation in like Chad, for example, a country who just nationalized ExxonMobil, and a part of a pipeline. The current interim president, Idris Deby, is actually the son of the former president, and the former president was killed in a military operation, not like he was attacked, but the president was on the ground fighting extremists.
Wow.
And since then, his son who is the interim president has freed almost 400 of this same rebel faction who killed his father. He's tried to engage in negotiations, and those negotiations have once again fallen through. But he is actually making effort. So, these military juntas, they call them non-democratic, but they're actually extremely popular. So that, makes me ask, what is democracy? Is democracy some bureaucratic system that requires different levels of voting, or is it like something that, enforces the will of the people? So, I think, it's these countries that want to invade risk destabilizing themselves further and putting their own power at risk. And we could see a revolution in Senegal. We could see a revolution in Nigeria if this escalates too far. So they need to take care of their own their own house before they go worrying about their neighbors.
Right. Well, it's like the term democracy. It's just like any other label in politics. It can always be misused to hide a power dynamic. And
right.
the U.S. will say this is a democracy, but it's a fake democracy. And it's like the demonization of the word populism a few years ago in the mainstream media. Right. It's like populism is what we're talking about.
Is that a bad thing?
Exactly.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, it's democracy is more often than not all the time, but democracy more often than not is just a word governments use until it's no longer convenient. And I think that's the unfortunate reality. What I think we actually need to judge countries on is not by who says they're democratic or not, but the popularity of those governments.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Genuine popularity, not the U.S.
Assessed.
Right. I mean, the U.S. government isn't popular. I mean, the U.S. government hasn't been popular in the United States, no matter which party is in power, for decades. So
what's phenomenal is you have the Biden administration pointing the finger at this Niger government and saying, "You're not popular." It's like everyone hates Biden. We all want to.
And they are popular. They're quite popular.
Yeah, so it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and Biden's approval rating is atrocious. I mean,
got to be in the 20s.
And the corruption
actual approval has to be in the 20.
Yeah, in DC and
Yeah,
the power bases, and that's about it.
Yeah. Well, so how would you, when you were talking about the fight spreading in Africa, I don't quite visualize how that would happen because I don't even understand how like soldiers from Nigeria and especially from Senegal, I mean, Senegalese people really hate their government now. Like how young men would be even recruited in numbers enough to be loyal enough to their government to go fight another country because they all understand the politics in Niger. It's all over the internet. They know that that's a government that cares about its people more than the Senegalese government. So, I mean, they look at the government of Niger and they're like, I wish I had that president. And then they're supposed to go fight him. I don't understand how that would even get kicked off.
Well, and I think that would be a big part of what destabilizes countries like Senegal and Nigeria. But Nigeria has one of the strongest, I think it's the third strongest military in Africa before Egypt and Algeria. But if they get the orders, despite their dislike of what happens, they will invade. Then, it's not like you have an option.
Like, because Ukraine lasts because they're able to like force these guys to conscript these guys. Well, first of all, they had 10 years of propaganda that got it kicked off. So like my friends who are Ukrainian can't even talk to them anymore because it's just like, there's no way to communicate because they're so, I mean, their eyes just turn red when we talk about Russia. They don't have any, and it's all propaganda. So they don't have this in Africa. They haven't prepped the populations to hate Niger for 10 years. So
and that's part of the reason I don't see it being successful is if it does happen. But in terms of like at least an attempt being made, it's possible. I think there's a lot of external pressure in France. France is facing its own problems and they need the resources. That being said, I don't think it would be popular at all. I think you'd have people switching sides. I think you'd have Nigeria and Senegal being destabilized. And it could be that it doesn't happen at all. And
it's not like if it does, it's just going to be a big L. Like it doesn't seem like there's no way. Like, right?
And we see this in the emerging multipolar world, this trend of whenever sort of imperial actors try to do something, the blowback is always worse. You see this with the sanctions on Russia. Russia's economy is doing just fine. I was there, 2 months ago. It's incredible. The only thing that's actually more expensive is clothing. And there's plenty of clothing to go around in Russia. It's not like people are going without clothing. And the Nord Stream pipeline, Russia's making a ton of money right now from oil still. And prices have gone up and they're capitalizing on that. So, and also the invasion itself has solidified Russia's support throughout the global south, the majority of the world, in terms of population.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, so Tara and I have been interested in the idea of sanctions as like a unexpected, like the unexpected failure of sanctions or the unexpected benefits of sanctions if you're the target of sanctions. Because in Iran, it's forced Iran to become very self-sufficient and look for really strong allies in the world and develop them. And so they would have never done that. They would have just been like, and the funny thing is that's the whole point of like farms.
They're more resourceful
that we do in the U.S. We like give free food to countries so that they don't become self-sufficient, and then we sanction others and we say that's harmful, but it's not. In the long run, you're actually telling them to become self-sufficient. So it's like I don't understand.
And we see, I hate to point to a militaristic aspect of it, but Iran has become incredibly creative, especially with their missile program. Their missile program is like the third best in the world, and their drones are some of the best in the world. I mean, their missiles are insanely accurate, probably more accurate than a lot of the missile systems in Ukraine right now, which are allegedly up to NATO standards. And their drones have changed. We keep talking about, the Ukrainians are getting this weapon or this weapon, and it's a game changer. And it's never quite the game changer people want it to be. But the drones that Iran has sent and the intellectual property that Iran has given to Russia have enabled Russia to actually change the dynamic on the battlefield to a significant extent.
Well, we just covered that. Satara, you want to talk about what we just covered about that? Like about what the U.S. did to ask.
Yeah, there was an article by which one was it? U.S. News? I don't remember, but one of these mainstream American news, and the headline was the U.S. asks Iran to stop sending drones to Russia. Like usually you wouldn't see that ever. It's like asks.
They politely ask Iran to stop sending drones. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not gonna happen.
And it's like they're like criminals. It's like the thief robbing your house asks you kindly to like leave the light on or what. I mean, it's like I mean, why would Iran want to take any orders from the U.S.? It's just
if the United States were like, yeah, we'll remove all sanctions permanently, maybe.
Totally.
But even then, I don't think Iran would go for that, because look what happened with the JCPOA and Obama. Obama put through the JCPOA. Trump came in 4 years later and tore it to shreds, while Iran was not in violation of it. They were following
exactly.
it by the book. So, Iran is very smart. The government is very smart. They know that they can't trust the word of the United States. So even if the United States offered to do that, Trump is probably gonna come back in power, and he'll just reapply the sanctions. So it's. Well, I don't think there's anything the U.S. could do to stop.
Yeah, because Iranians have like a history of trusting the U.S. and then being betrayed, so they have learned their ways not to like totally trust the U.S. It started when Mossadegh in 1953 asked the U.S. government to help prevent a coup against him by the UK, but the U.S. came actually and helped them overthrow him. So they know they have never seen good faith coming from the U.S. even before the revolution. So there is no reason for them to trust the U.S.
And the same thing is true in Nicaragua. And I think that's why we see relations between Nicaragua and Iran advancing, because they have so much in common. Not only are they both governments that heavily focus on sort of indigenous rights, not from a Western sort of narrative, but from an authentic indigenous rights angle. And Press TV just released a documentary about Nicaragua, and there's one part towards the end where my friend Ahmed Caballo goes into an indigenous Mikitu town and interviews an older woman, and she didn't speak Spanish. She doesn't speak Spanish. This woman only spoke Mikitu, which is a very rare language, and I had a friend actually translate that part. And one of the things she said in this documentary is that they can come at Danielle, they can come after Danielle and try to remove him only when they kill all Mikitu. And so this woman is an elderly woman and extremely passionate. I highly recommend.
Oh, did you cut out?
Yeah, we lost him.
I'll have to figure out what the name of that documentary is and put it in the links, because I would like to watch it too. Well, it looks like we just lost Benjamin, and we haven't been reconnected. So we're probably going to call this the end of the podcast, and we can record a future one with Benjamin if we can arrange that. That would be great. I just wanted to leave with a few thoughts based on what he was just saying. And one is, I think that the U.S. has had, especially with Islamic governments, a campaign to try and demonize the idea of having a religious government, when in many cases the U.S. is critiqued as being a Christian nation, which is obviously not true because we have the separation of religion and state. But with the idea of a religious government like Iran has, the value of that is downplayed in the West is that you have like a core set of values that are they're outside of legal discourse. It's something that you can put in a spiritual realm, which is harder to argue away than legal discourse. And so I think you do end up with a kind of indigenous sense of justice in that government. I think a good example of that is in the weapons development, in that the U.S., whenever it develops weapons, it inevitably tests them on some poor, trapped population somewhere. Like in Gaza is a great example. It always has Israeli weapons, partners who test weapons over there, or in Iraq, they were just testing all these new weapons on people, innocent people who had no role in it, but then they could just say that their weapons were now field tested. So they do all that. They use the weapons all the time to invade and destroy countries all around the world. And Iran has a very developed military technology, and they don't invade anyone. They don't test their military on any innocent civilian. So it's actually very remarkable that they can have such an advanced military and not be using it to invade countries and do terrible things like the U.S. does. So I think that's commendable, and it's an example of a government that actually has some kind of moral fortitude. I'm not saying like governments are all, there's good governments anywhere. I think all governments inherently have a power dynamic which leads to some injustice, but there are definitely some governments that the structure of the government is set up so that they are less prone to injustice than others. And I think Iran and Nicaragua are a good example of that. So that's what I was going to leave it at. So
Sure.
do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when it comes to describing, for example, Iran's establishment as being religious or being a theocracy, you also see, apart from the points that you mentioned, you also see a double standard. Like nobody talks about the Zionist regime or the Israeli regime as being a theocracy, while everything that they claim, like all the occupation and everything that they claim, is based on what they claim is based on a Jewish ideology.
God gave them the land, right? They're able to take it because God gave it to them.
Exactly.
30%.
But you never hear
level of atheism of any country in the world. One of the highest levels, like 30+%. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but in the rhetoric you always hear that, like you said, that this has been a God promised land and everything, and nobody is talking about Israel as being a theocracy or being a religious government or anything. But they're quick to blame Iran for being run over religious ideology, pretext to say that Iran's government is not legitimate or it's a theocracy, in a negative way.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit there, but you were saying that it's a false pretext to say that it's theocracy and to use mullah as a derogatory term when we don't use priest as a derogatory term in the U.S. or
rabbi.
Rabbi is never a derogatory term. Oh my gosh. So yeah, there are a lot of double standards, and people just aren't aware of how propaganda is so ingrained in their soul. But that's sadly how it is, and that's why we talk about those things. So if you have anything else to add, or I'll just wrap it up there. All right. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us on another episode of this podcast, Twice Told Tales. Tell your friends about it. Like and subscribe. Leave us a comment or two. Tell us what you'd like to hear about, and we'll see you again next time.